My grandfather built Harland Feed and Supply out of a converted tobacco barn and a handshake loan he paid back in 14 months. My stepfather's brother tried to inherit it 11 days after the funeral. I let him have it, every single share. And I sat quietly in that conference room in Asheville while his attorney opened the asset schedule and watched the color leave the man's face like water draining out of a tub. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning, because the beginning matters. It always does with stories like this. My name is Colt Harlan. I'm 41 years old. I grew up in Weaverville, North Carolina, which is a small town just north of Asheville in the Blue Ridge foothills. The kind of place where people still wave at trucks they don't recognize, and where a man's name on a building means something different than it does in a city. My grandfather, Earl Harlan, started Harland Feed and Supply in 1978 in a barn he converted himself over 2 summers, pouring concrete floors on weekends while working a day job driving propane trucks for a fuel company out of Hendersonville. He was 32 years old when he opened the doors. He had $1,100 in a checking account, a used Caterpillar forklift he'd bought off an estate sale in Arden, and a reputation in Buncombe County for being exactly as honest as he said he was. Nothing more, nothing less. By the time I was born in 1983, Feed and Supply had grown into the largest independent farm supply operation in the western North Carolina mountains. 3 retail locations, Weaverville, Marshall, and Burnsville, plus a wholesale distribution arm that supplied smaller co-ops and hardware outfits across 7 counties. Seed, fertilizer, feed fencing, irrigation, custom mixed supplements for livestock. The kind of business that doesn't make headlines but keeps the working land of a region alive. My grandfather employed 63 people at peak season. He knew all of their names, their spouses' names, and in most cases which high school their kids were attending. He was a compact man, Earl Harlan. 5'9" on a good day, which he would tell you was 5'10". He wore the same style of red wing boots for 40 years, and bought them 2 pairs at a time because he'd found the model he liked and didn't see any reason to change what worked. He ate lunch at the counter of the same diner in Weaverville every day he was in town, a place called Pauline's which has since closed, which still bothers me more than I can fully explain. He ordered the same thing every time, a hot beef sandwich, a cup of soup, black coffee. He never carried a cell phone until my grandmother made him get one in 2009, and then he only used it to call family. He considered email a form of theater. He was also a man who loved carefully and not always wisely. My grandmother, Ruth Harlan, passed away from pancreatic cancer in the spring of 2014. She was 76 years old. She and my grandfather had been married for 53 years. He handled her death in the way men of his generation handle the unbearable, which is to say he didn't handle it so much as he absorbed it, kept moving, and never once admitted to anyone that the moving was harder without her. I drove up from Charlotte, where I was living at the time working as a regional manager for an agricultural equipment distributor, and I stayed with him for 2 weeks after the funeral. He cooked his own meals, answered his own mail, went into the store every morning at 7. He was 70 years old, and he was made of something that doesn't bend. He met Pamela Voss in the fall of 2015. She was 54 years old. He was 71. She had been widowed 3 years earlier when her husband, a retired insurance underwriter named David Voss, passed away from a stroke in Brevard. She was working part-time as a bookkeeper for a landscaping company in Asheville and doing volunteer coordination for a historical preservation nonprofit in the area. She was well-presented, socially easy, the kind of woman who remembered what you'd told her 3 months ago and asked about it like it mattered. My grandfather found her through a mutual acquaintance at a church function and asked her to dinner twice before she said yes, which he told me about with something approaching pride. I tried to like Pamela. I want to be clear about that. I made the effort. She was not unkind to me directly. She asked about my work, remembered my daughter's name, sent a card when I got remarried in 2017. But there was something underneath the warmth that I could never quite name. A calculation behind the friendliness. An attentiveness that seemed aimed less at connection and more at assessment. She kept track of things, prices, values, which properties belong to whom, in the way that people who are building a mental inventory do. I noticed it. I told myself I was being uncharitable because I was grieving my grandmother and looking for reasons not to like whoever filled that space. They married in the spring of 2017. Pamela became Pamela Harlan. She was 56. My grandfather was 73. I was 34 and I stood at the reception and shook hands and smiled and drove home to Charlotte and sat with a feeling I couldn't name for about a week. What I know with certainty is that by 2019, Pamela's older brother, a man named Russell Voss, had begun appearing in my grandfather's world in ways that felt structural rather than casual. Russell was 61 years old, recently retired from a career in commercial real estate development in Greenville, South Carolina. He was the kind of man who walks into a room and immediately starts calculating what everything in it is worth. He had opinions about Earl's business that he offered without being asked, framed as friendly observations. He started coming around the Weaverville store. He had lunch with my grandfather. He asked questions about margins, about the wholesale contracts, about the real estate the stores were sitting on. 3 parcels my grandfather owned outright. My grandfather mentioned Russell to me on the phone in October 2019, almost in passing. Said Russell had some interesting ideas about restructuring the distribution arm. I asked what kind of ideas. Well, the kind that involved bringing in a partner. I said, Pawpaw, you don't need a partner. He said, I know that, Colt. I know that. I drove up 2 weekends later. We sat on his porch in Weaverville and I told him directly, as plainly as I could without making it about Pamela, that I had concern that the business was not just his asset, it was people's livelihoods. That 63 families were attached to decisions he made about ownership and structure. He looked at me across his porch railing with those steady gray eyes and said, Colt, I built this thing from a dirt floor and a borrowed lift. You think I don't know what I've got? I believe he did know. I believe he knew clearly and completely. What he also knew, and what I didn't find out until much later, was that he had already started doing something about it. He was diagnosed with congestive heart failure in early 2021. His cardiologist, a man named Dr. Frederick Cho at Mission Hospital in Asheville, described it as a manageable condition that would require significant lifestyle adjustments and close monitoring. He managed it, adjusting nothing about his lifestyle except the things Dr. Cho made medically unavoidable. He still went into the store. He still drove himself to Pauline's, and then after Pauline's closed, he found a different diner that he liked less, but went to anyway because the habit mattered. He talked about retirement with the same wry affection he'd always had for things he had no intention of doing. He passed away on a Monday morning in September 23. He was 79 years old. He died at home, in the house he and my grandmother had shared for 40 years, with Pamela in the next room. I got the call at 7:14 in the morning. I was on the road from Charlotte to Weaverville in 25 minutes. He looked like himself. That was the thing I hadn't expected, how much he still looked exactly like himself. There is something both a relief and a devastation about that. I stood in his bedroom for a long time. From the hallway I could hear Pamela's voice, measured, precise, speaking to what I assumed was the funeral home. I noted the tone, filed it away, told myself the same thing I'd told myself before, that I was reading into it because grief makes you look for villains. The funeral was held the following Saturday at a church in Weaverville that my grandfather had attended for 40 years. The parking lot was full before 10 in the morning. Farmers, suppliers, county officials, men in Carhartt jackets and women who had driven an hour each way to be there. The pastor talked about a man who had shaken more hands honestly than any 10 people combined. He wasn't wrong. Pamela sat in the front row in a black dress and responded to condolences with the composed grace of a woman who had done this before and knew the choreography. She thanked everyone. She held hands when appropriate. She was, as always, exactly right. 9 days after my grandfather's funeral, I received a phone call. It was from an estate attorney in Asheville named Gordon Fitch, calling on behalf of Pamela Harlan. Mr. Fitch informed me that pursuant to the most recently executed will of Earl James Harlan, dated February 2023, Pamela Harlan was the sole beneficiary of the estate, which included the family residence, all personal financial accounts, and 100% of the shares in Harlan Feed and Supply LLC. He was polite about it, professionally courteous. He used phrases like orderly transition and personal effects, and suggested that if I wished to retrieve any items of sentimental value from the family home, I should coordinate through his office within 30 days. I hung up the phone and stood in my kitchen in Charlotte for a while. My wife, Deanna, was at the table. She looked at me. I told her what the call was. She started to say something. I shook my head, not to stop her, but because I wasn't ready to say anything yet. I poured a cup of coffee. I sat down. I thought about my grandfather's voice on the phone that October 3 years ago, certain and unhurried. You think I don't know what I've got? And then I thought about what he'd said 6 months after that on a Sunday afternoon when we were walking the back property behind the Weaverville store. And he'd stopped at the fence line and said, Without particular context, Colt, you know I talked to Len about restructuring. Len being Leonard Marsh, not a lawyer, but my grandfather's accountant of 30 years. I had nodded and not pushed it, assumed he meant estate planning in the standard sense, and the conversation had moved on. I called my attorney the next morning. Her name is Susan Albright. She is 53 years old, a business and estate litigation attorney based in Charlotte with 26 years of experience and a specialty in closely held family business succession disputes. I had worked with Susan on a contract matter 2 years earlier and trusted her the way you trust someone who has shown you how they operate under pressure. She picked up on the first ring. Colt, I heard what happened. I'm sorry about your grandfather. Susan, I need to know everything about a will dated February 2023. I need you to come in today if you can. There are things that should be said in person. I was in her office on South Tryon Street by noon. She had a file on her desk that was thicker than I expected. She did not waste time. Your grandfather called me in November 2022, she said. He had concerns about the direction of certain conversations around the business. He asked me to help him think through some protective options. He came to you before he came to me. He didn't want to put you in the middle of his marriage. He also, she said carefully, had not yet documented what he suspected. He only had instincts. But your grandfather had very good instincts. What my grandfather had done, quietly and methodically over 4 months in the winter and spring of 2022 and 2023, with Susan's help and with Leonard Marsh's accounting support, was restructure Harland Feed and Supply in a way that was legally sound, thoroughly documented, and completely invisible to Pamela. He had converted his ownership interest in Harland Feed and Supply, LLC, into a structure that involved a family trust, the Earl J. Harlan Family Trust, and a separate operating entity. The trust named a designated trustee and a designated successor for operational control of all business assets. The trustee was Susan Albright. The successor for business operations and ownership was me, his only grandchild. The February 2023 will that Gordon Fitch was waving around was real. My grandfather had signed it. It was valid. And it left Pamela the family residence, the personal financial accounts, which were considerable, and 100% of the shares in Harland Feed and Supply, LLC, which as of the restructuring completed in January 2023, contained no operating assets, no inventory, no real property, no equipment, no active contracts, no receivables, and no employees. The LLC was a legal shell, a clean one, a name and a registered agent, and nothing else. Everything that actually constituted the business, the 3 store locations and the real estate beneath them, the fleet of delivery vehicles, the wholesale distribution contracts, the inventory, the supplier relationships, the licenses, the brand, the payroll, the 63 people who came to work every morning, had been transferred into the operating entity held by the trust 10 months before my grandfather signed that will. Gordon Fitch had informed me I had 30 days to retrieve my grandfather's sentimental belongings. He was about to discover that his client had inherited a corporate filing number and a filing fee. Susan looked at me across her desk. Pamela will challenge this. Gordon Fitch is experienced and he will argue fraudulent conveyance, that your grandfather intentionally stripped assets from the estate to defeat spousal inheritance rights. Can he make that argument stick? Not easily. The restructuring has a clean audit trail and documented business rationale. North Carolina gives a surviving spouse the right to claim an elective share of the augmented estate, but the timing and the records are going to make that case very difficult for them to build. She paused. My recommendation, Colt, is that you don't fight it in the way they expect. Do something they won't anticipate. I looked at her. Agree to everything, she said. Give Pamela exactly what the February 2023 will specifies. The house, the accounts, the LLC. I sat with that, and then let Gordon Fitch open the books. I drove back to Charlotte that evening and sat on my back porch and watched the sun go down over the tree line. I thought about my grandfather the last time I'd seen him, about 3 weeks before he died, sitting on his own porch in Weaverville with a cup of coffee and the particular stillness of a man who has made his decisions and is at rest with them. He hadn't said anything significant that afternoon. We'd talked about the store in Burnsville, about a supplier contract, about the weather turning. But he had looked at me at one point while we were sitting quietly and said, "You'll do fine," just like that. Unprompted, no context, "You'll do fine." I hadn't known what he meant at the time. I did now. Pamela sent me a text 4 days after the funeral. 4 days. The restraint was notable given the circumstances. "Thomas," she wrote, and then she corrected it. "Colt, I hope we can approach this with maturity. Gordon will be in touch about next steps. Approach this with maturity. A text message from a woman who had called me by the wrong name in the first draft. I read it twice, set the phone down, made dinner, grilled chicken, roasted potatoes, the same thing my grandfather used to make on Sunday evenings when I was a kid staying at his house in the summers. I hadn't made it in years. I made it that night and didn't entirely know why until I was halfway through eating it. Gordon Fitch called Susan the following Tuesday. She relayed the substance of the conversation to me the same afternoon in a voice note that I listened to while sitting in my truck outside the Weaverville store, the one with my grandfather's name still painted above the door. Gordon had delivered Pamela's position clearly and with force. The February 2023 will was valid. Pamela was the rightful sole beneficiary. She expected full and timely transfer of all estate assets, including Harland Feed and Supply, LLC. Gordon had made pointed mention of the fact that any effort to introduce alternative legal structures or delay the process would be met with immediate and aggressive litigation. He had used the phrase "leave nothing standing." Susan's response, delivered with the measured calm of someone who has argued in rooms most people never enter and won in most of them, was this: Colt Harlan had no intention of contesting the will. He would comply fully with its terms. All LLC shares would be transferred to Pamela Harlan as specified. Papers would be prepared immediately. A pause on Gordon's end, Susan said. Then, after a moment, that's straightforward. Colt simply wants his grandfather's wishes honored, Susan had replied. He's not looking for a fight. I want to pause here and say something honest about those weeks between the funeral and the hearing, because I think it matters, and because this channel is called what it's called for a reason. I was genuinely grieving, not performing grief, not setting it aside for strategy, genuinely, fully grieving in the way you grieve when you lose the person who was the fixed point of your family's map. My grandfather was the person I called when I didn't know what to do. He was the person whose opinion I sought before any significant decision, and whose approval, even at 41 years old, I still wanted in a way I never quite outgrew. The silence where a phone call used to be, the reflex of picking up the phone to tell him something and then remembering. Grief doesn't pause for legal proceedings, it just runs underneath them. But grief also has a way of clarifying what is true. And what was true, standing in that parking lot outside the Weaverville store in the October mountain air, was that my grandfather had prepared something. He had seen what was coming, or something close enough to it, and he had built a response the way he built everything. Quietly, carefully, with clean work and no wasted effort. The least I could do was carry it to completion without knocking anything over. The people running the stores through all of this were steady because they had been briefed. My grandfather's operations director, a woman named Beverly Croft, had been with Harland Feed and Supply for 16 years. Beverly was 58, precise and entirely unimpressed by drama. She had been brought into the restructuring plan months earlier, at my grandfather's instruction, and she ran the daily operations through the estate proceedings, with the flat competence of someone who understood that payroll doesn't stop for inheritance disputes. The stores stayed open. The wholesale contracts kept moving. The employees kept their jobs because the trust structure had completely insulated the operations from the estate proceedings. By design. I had one direct conversation with Pamela during this period. A Wednesday afternoon in late October, 3 weeks before the hearing, while I was up in Weaverville walking the inventory at the Marshall location. She called, and I stepped outside to take it. Colt. Her voice was the familiar warm professional register, turned up a careful degree. I just want you to know that I'm not trying to make this difficult. Your grandfather loved you. I've always known that. I appreciate you saying so, I said. I matched her tone exactly, which required some concentration. Gordon tells me your attorney has been cooperative. She paused, like she was deciding whether to push further. That means a lot, Colt. Truly. I'm just trying to respect what Pawpaw put in writing. Another pause. Something shifted in it. Some recalibration happening on her end. Some reassessment of whether I was naive or resigned or had simply given up. I was at that moment standing behind the Marshall store in the parking lot looking at a delivery truck with Harland Feed and Supply printed on the side in my grandfather's original logo, the one he'd designed himself in 1978 with a hand-drawn font. I looked at that logo while she decided what to say next. I think we can still be family, she said finally. Of course, I said. She hung up. I stood there for a while. It was cold up in Marshall in late October, the mountains already doing that thing they do in the fall, where the air gets clean and hard and honest. I thought about what she had said. Family. I thought about the fact that in roughly 3 weeks, the word was going to mean something very different to her. The hearing was held on a Thursday morning in early November 2023, Buncombe County Superior Court in downtown Asheville. Susan had filed all the paperwork for the voluntary and uncontested transfer of LLC shares. Clean, cooperative, exactly what Pamela's attorney had demanded and had not expected to receive without a fight. I drove up from Charlotte the night before and stayed at a hotel on Marymount Avenue, the same street my grandfather used to drive every Thursday on his way to the feed auction in Arden. I wore a navy blazer and khakis. My grandfather would have called it church clothes on a Tuesday, which in his vocabulary meant appropriate but not pretentious. I parked downtown and walked 2 blocks to the courthouse with the November mountain air cold and sharp and smelling faintly of wood smoke from somewhere up the ridge. Susan was in the hallway outside the hearing room with her associate, a man named Paul Dexter, 40. Who handled trust documentation with the quiet thoroughness of someone who takes precision personally. He had built the holding entity structure, Susan told me, and he looked that morning like a man who had thought through every possible version of what was about to happen and had arrived at the same conclusion each time. Pamela arrived at 8:50 with Gordon Fitch. She was dressed carefully, charcoal blazer, understated jewelry, the presentation of a woman who expected to be confirmed in possession of something real. Gordon was in his late 60s, silver-haired, the practiced ease of a litigator who has been in a great number of rooms and won in most of them. He greeted Susan with a professional nod and opened his briefcase on the table. The hearing was administrative. No jury, no drama, just a judge, a court officer, and the formal transfer of an estate. The judge reviewed the filings. She confirmed the validity of the February 2023 will. She confirmed that Colt Harlan had consented without contest to the transfer of all LLC shares to Pamela Harlan. She asked Susan directly if her client had any objection. Susan said, "None, Your Honor. Mr. Harlan is in full agreement." Pamela's posture in her chair shifted slightly, the particular shift of someone who came armed for a battle and is quietly recalculating what the absence of one means. The judge approved the transfer. She signed the order. That was the moment Gordon reached for the asset schedule. Under the court's procedure, the supporting documentation itemizing what the LLC contained had to be reviewed on the record before the transfer was formally closed. Gordon opened the folder. He read the first page, he turned to the second, he turned to the third, he stopped. I was watching his face. I had positioned myself where I could watch it without being obvious about it. I saw what happened not all at once, but in sequence, the way a structure settles when something essential shifts below the foundation. His eyes moved across the page twice. His hand, which had been moving steadily through the document, went still. He looked up at Susan. Susan looked back at him with an expression of total practiced calm, the expression of a woman who has read every line on every page in that folder and is not surprised by any of it. Gordon looked back down at the document. He read the line, the single sentence that described the current net asset value of Harland Feed and Supply, LLC as of the date of transfer, following the restructuring into the Earl J. Harland Family Trust completed in January 2023. Net asset value. The room was quiet for about 5 seconds. In a courtroom, 5 seconds is a long time. Gordon Fitch set the folder down on the table with the deliberate care of a man keeping his hands steady on purpose. He removed his reading glasses. He folded them. He placed them beside the folder with a precision that had nothing to do with the glasses and everything to do with maintaining composure. He looked at Susan Albright with an expression that was professionally neutral in its surface and losing that battle in its margins. "Counsel," he said, "I'd like to request a short recess." The judge granted it. Pamela leaned toward Gordon immediately. I heard the beginning of her question before his hand, placed lightly on her forearm, stopped her. "Not here," he said. The 2 words quiet and flat as a closed door. They moved into the hallway. I stayed at the table. Paul Dexter poured water from the pitcher on the table and slid a glass to me without comment. Susan looked at me. I looked back at her. "How are you holding up?" she asked quietly. I told her I was okay. I meant it. Through the glass panel beside the hearing room door, I could see Pamela reading. Gordon had the folder open in the hallway. He was showing her the page. I watched her read it. I watched her head come back up. And then I watched her face move through the stages. Confusion first, sharp and visible, and then a kind of stillness that was not calm, a held breath that was not patience, and then the particular expression of a person who understands suddenly that every assumption they carried into a room was built on something that is no longer there. She pushed through the hearing room door before Gordon could stop her. She looked at me. "What did you do?" Her voice was controlled, barely. "What is this? What did he do to the company?" I looked at her. I kept my voice even. I didn't do anything to the company, Pamela. This is what my grandfather did over a year ago. That's not legal. You can't, he couldn't just. He restructured the business, Susan said smoothly without emphasis. Any business owner has the full legal right to restructure their operational assets. The process was completed in January 2023 and is fully documented with clear business rationale. The will your client is relying on was executed in February 2023, after the restructuring was already complete. Everything Mr. Harland did was within his rights. He did this to cut me out. He did this on purpose. He did this to protect the business, Susan said. Whether those feel like the same thing to you is a matter of perspective. Gordon was back in the room, his hand again on Pamela's arm, gentle and firm, the practiced management of an attorney who has clients in difficult moments. Pamela sat down. Her breathing was the deliberate, measured kind of a person not allowing themselves to do something they can't take back. The judge returned. The transfer was completed. Pamela Harlan received 100% of the shares in Harland Feed and Supply, LLC, exactly as the February 2023 will had specified. She received the registered name, the corporate filing number, the original logo my grandfather had drawn by hand in 1978. She received the letterhead. Nothing else. I didn't say anything when it was over. I didn't feel the particular electricity of victory, because this was never about that. My grandfather hadn't built a legal structure to win an argument. He'd built it to protect something that had nothing to do with him anymore. 63 people who showed up to work every morning because the stores were still open and the checks still cleared. That was the thing worth protecting. That was what I was there to not knock over. Susan walked with me to the parking garage on Lexington Avenue after the hearing. The November mountain air was doing what it does in Asheville in the fall, cold and absolute and indifferent to what happens indoors. She said what I had already known she was going to say. Gordon will file a challenge, elective share claim under North Carolina, GS 30-3.1. He'll argue the restructuring constitutes a fraudulent transfer designed to defeat spousal rights. Can he win? File it. Winning is different. North Carolina's elective share covers assets transferred during the marriage, but the documentation on the restructuring is clean, and the business rationale is auditable. She paused. We also have something else that's going to complicate his argument considerably. During the weeks of preparation leading up to the hearing, Leonard Marsh, my grandfather's accountant, who had been part of the restructuring and who had, on my grandfather's instructions, been compiling financial records for over a year, had flagged something in the business accounts. Not new information exactly, but now formally documented. A pattern across 11 months of vendor payments. A landscaping and site maintenance vendor, sole proprietorship, no verifiable commercial address, no online presence, no county business registration. Payments totaling just under $190,000 over those 11 months, processed through the business accounts during the period when Pamela had been informally managing vendor billing for the Weaverville location, a role she had eased into over the previous 2 years, presenting herself to my grandfather as helpful. The payments traced to a single-member LLC registered in Tennessee with an address that turned out to be a mail forwarding service. The signatory on that LLC's bank account was Pamela Voss Harlan. Susan did not bring this to Gordon as leverage. She filed it with the court as part of the elective share proceeding, as documented financial history relevant to the augmented estate calculation, specifically as a reduction in net estate value attributable to transfers that the court might characterize as misconduct. Gordon Fitch withdrew from the case 3 weeks after the hearing. His withdrawal filing cited a conflict of interest. It was the polite legal language for what it actually meant. Pamela's new attorney was a woman named Andrea Sutton out of Black Mountain. Andrea was sharp and fast and understood within a week of taking the case that her client's negotiating position had already collapsed before she arrived. She called Susan with a settlement proposal inside of 30 days. Pamela would withdraw all elective share claims. She would accept the family residence, which was fully paid off and valued at approximately $800,000 in the current Asheville market, and the personal financial accounts, which totaled just over $350,000 after estate costs. She would sign a full and permanent release of any interest in the operating trust, the holding entity, and Harland Feed and Supply in any form. In exchange, the financial misconduct documentation would be treated as settled within the civil proceeding and not referred to the Buncombe County District Attorney's Office. Susan brought it to me on a Tuesday evening. We sat in her Charlotte office with the city going quiet outside the windows, and the light on South Tryon turning the particular blue of early winter evenings in the South. "It's a clean close," she said. "She walks away with real assets. You walk away with the business intact and a proceeding that ends here." I asked what I knew the answer to before I asked it. Does she deserve this? Susan looked at me steadily, the same way she had across that table 9 months earlier when all of this was just a phone call and a thick folder. "That's not a legal question, Colt. What I can tell you is that accepting this protects 63 employees, protects operations, and closes this without a criminal referral that could take years and cost more than it returns. What would your grandfather do?" I thought about that for a long moment. I thought about a man who sued less than he could have, and settled more than most people respected, and built a business across 45 years that had not a single unresolved dispute with a supplier or a contractor, because he paid what he owed and expected the same, and when the math didn't work he fixed it cleanly and moved on. "He'd take the settlement," I said. Susan nodded. "I know. I signed the agreement on a Wednesday morning in December 2023, 14 weeks after my grandfather's funeral. I drove up to Weaverville after I signed. It was a cold, clear morning. The mountains cut hard against the sky the way they get in December, when all the leaves are down and the ridgelines are bare. I parked behind the Weaverville store and walked the loading dock where I had spent half my childhood running around my grandfather's ankles while he worked. Beverly Croft was already there, clipboard in hand, directing a morning delivery with the flat efficiency she brought to everything. She looked at me when she saw me come around the corner. "Well," she said. "It's done," I said. "Good," she said, and turned back to the delivery driver. That was Beverly. The store ran on. I stood at the loading dock for a while, in the cold, in the sound of machinery and pallets and ordinary work. My grandfather had stood in this exact spot for 40 years. Different seasons, same sounds. The sound of something that lasts. There is one thing I've been turning over since all of this ended, and I want to say it plainly because I think it's worth saying. My grandfather was 79 years old when he died. In the last 2 years of his life, managing a cardiac condition, slowing down in ways he would never admit to, he had the discipline and the clarity to consult an attorney, work with his accountant, restructure a 45-year-old business, document his reasons, and protect an enterprise that 63 families depended on. He didn't do it in anger. He didn't do it for revenge. He did it because he was the kind of man who thought about what happened after he was gone, the way builders think about the structure after they're no longer on site. He understood that the work outlasts the worker. He had always understood that. He just made sure the paperwork reflected it. I had spent years being careful with Pamela, careful to be the cooperative adult grandchild who didn't make the old man's marriage harder than it needed to be, and I understand that instinct. I don't regret it entirely. But careful neutrality has a cost. And the cost, in this case, was that a pattern developed inside the business that it required emergency documentation to correct. The lesson I carry from this is not that you should treat everyone in your family as a suspect. The lesson is simpler and older than that. Love and attention are not the same thing. You can love a person and still read the accounts. You can trust a relationship and still know what the paperwork says. You can be loyal to your family and still understand, precisely and without apology, what you own and what the structure of that ownership actually is. My grandfather knew. He knew from the time he borrowed $1,100 and poured his own concrete floor. He built accordingly, all the way to the end. And when he was done, he left me something I could carry forward. The stores are open. The employees are working. The December delivery schedules are running on time, because Beverly Croft has never in 16 years let a delivery run late, and she is not about to start. And every morning, wherever I am, I make the same breakfast, grilled chicken if it's Sunday, and on the other days, the thing he made. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, black coffee. No shortcuts, no substitutions. That's how you know what you're building. You don't cut corners on the small things, and the big things take care of themselves.